In Shaktoolik, the most prominent changes I've noticed are the lack of sea ice and how freeze up happens later in the year. Those affect our hunting seasons that were used to happening at a certain time. Depending on if it's too hot or too cold, it affects how much fish we get, the quality of fish and animals and birds. They might have diseases because the water's too warm, or they might be really small because they haven't had adequate food supply, or if it's too hot and there's not enough rain, then there might not be enough berries that we're used to getting, which affects our food supply. And also the summers are a lot hotter and they seem a little bit longer. Because the seasons start later or earlier, that affects when we're used to preparing for the subsistence harvest.
Inupiaq people here in Unalakleet depended on the very subsistence that we go after. And their climate change has changed a lot in the animal behavior, especially I noticed that the herring that came each spring didn't spawn right on the rocks. The water was too warm for them, so they spawned in deeper water. That's one of the things that happened. Temperature of the water upriver, because we did have a lot of dead humpies, good, just fresh humpies floating down the river. The land has changed a lot in terms of the amount of machinery that came around. Everything was done by either walking or by a dog team. It almost seems like the land has changed a lot, and how much damage is done to the surface. The weather has changed so much that it changed our hunting patterns, because the ice that we used to have was nice, and it was solid ice. It stayed around till probably the middle of June. But nowadays it melts, say, like in the early part of May. Traditionally, I think most people know that the Eskimos use a kayak, and they used to venture off out in the ocean a lot. But climate change has changed that, so that's pretty much, it's probably unsafe for anybody to go out in the ice, say, like in the middle of May. So it's changed, and we have to do things earlier. Even then, the ice doesn't get thick enough for us to go out and feel safe out in the ice.
Recently, I've been working with Bering Sea Elders as a board member and as an alternate board member, and we have been concerned about everything that impacts our communities. And we live in rural Alaska. We're at the Bering Sea, Norton Sound, eastern Norton Sound. We depend on our whole watershed, beginning in the mountains all the way to the ocean. The Bering Sea Elders worked on climate change issues, and primarily with the impacts on the ocean. We're seeing very rapid changes during my lifetime. And so it's really critical to understand the relationships between weather, pollution, industrial development, and the people that live in villages that are dependent on subsistence.
With the lack of ice, the permafrost on the tundra melts, and so some of our lakes might be bigger. Our rivers are changing faster than they used to, I think. And we're seeing different kinds of fish or animals, or some of those fish or animals we're used to getting, they might have sores or diseases on them we're not used to seeing.
it's hard to look forward to see what's going to come in the future, but we can look back to see what happened. And right now, we have a good example of what has happened. And, it's impacting everybody, but in different ways. Uh, so, we depend on fish and wildlife and stuff like that, for direct food consumption, and that affects timing. Uh, so it's really hard to say because societies change. We have gone through change, but there's a lot of impact beside weather and climate change. It's how people react to what's going on in each of the communities, and the people are good problem solvers for their own location, but it's really hard to get a coordinated effort to recognize a problem and how to address it. So it's really hard. We know what we have done so far, but we don't know how future generations are going to address it. And historically we know that everything needs to have food. So you have all kinds of predators depending on each other. And so it's an interaction of the food chain and how people address the interaction.
Well, I was flying. I noticed that I saw a black cloud that always seemed to have developed toward the afternoon, and it wasn't natural. It wasn't natural. It was man-made cloud. I think a lot of the smoke or the pollution that comes from factories just kind of got up into the jet stream and settled down in our area here. And it was the first time I recognized that life was changing, and it was changing rapidly.
It's an environmental concern, and everybody's worried about different things right now. The impact on the caribou herd, the fish, the reindeer, the migrating, everything. There's impacts on them, and you can see when animals are suffering, we suffer too. When animals suffer, we suffer too. So, and it all goes down to the food chain, on how it's affected the food chain. What can we do to make adjustments to address those things? Those are very complex issues, and you have different ways of looking at problem solving, and it really depends on how you live, what your food sources are, and how does climate impact that. And it's a very complex issue, and it needs to be addressed as we go along as quickly as possible. Thank you.